Welcome back to the 5280 pitch, women's soccer at altitude. I'm Kate Hansen, and if you've been riding with me for the past few weeks, you already know this. Things have been moving fast, like faster than an expansion team usually moves, and especially the past 2 weeks have been moving like warp speed. We have done 5 straight player profile episodes. We went deep, we took our time, we told stories, and then all of a sudden, the news cycle just absolutely hit the accelerator. More signings, big signings. The schedule was released. The announcement came that the stadium wasn't going to be ready in time. And then, kind of quietly but very significantly, that update on the Centennial Stadium said they weren't going to be ready for the start of the season. So today, it's not going to be about breaking news. It's not going to be about profiles. Today, I'm going to reset things a little bit. Today's episode is going to be a bit of a breath and say, okay, where are we at right now? Because believe it or not, we are just a few months away from kickoff. And if you are a fan trying to follow the Denver Summit FC in real time, the last couple of weeks have probably felt a little disorienting. And that's not criticism, that's just the reality of a brand new club building itself in public. So let's start with the obvious headline, because even though I did a full episode on it last week, it still changes the gravity of everything else. Lindsey Heaps. Yep, when that signing dropped, it didn't just add a player, it changed the context of the roster. Before Heaps, we were talking about promise, we were talking about long-term vision. After Heaps, we are talking about standards, about credibility, about what this team is going to look like on day one, not just in year 3. And that's why this episode matters, because once you add a player like Heaps, somebody that, like I said, I already spent an entire episode unpacking. So when you're done with today's episode, head on back to last week's. You have to go back and reevaluate every other move through a new lens. And then after Heaps, there was a ton more signings. So here's what jumped out to me when I went back and looked at all of the signings that the Summit have done so far this year. And the wave of all the new signings that they've done don't just feel random to me anymore. It feels like everything has snapped into place. Early on, this roster felt patient. It felt intentional. And compared to Boston, which is also an expansion team, it might have felt a little quiet. In fact, I saw on social media, the NWSL did a graphic of the Boston expansion team doing their signings versus the Summit doing theirs. And it was like 13 signings to 6, and then another 4 signings, and then 3. And looking at how they were doing their roster build compared to ours felt very, very quiet. A mix of defenders, midfielders, attackers, a couple local ties, some international flair, but it wasn't screaming anything yet. It was more of like an outline of a puzzle. Now we're starting to see the picture, because when you zoom out, the Summit strategy looks less like, let's win the headlines, and more like, let's make sure this thing functions. And that might sound a little bit boring, but if you've watched this league long enough, you know that functionality is survival. This is also where the timing of everything matters. The Lindsey Heaps signing didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened right as the roster was reaching a critical mass. The preseason calendar was tightening. The schedule was days away from being released. And the reality of the venue situation, that became public the next day. That is a lot for 1 week. And if you're the club, those things are all connected. If you're a fan, they can feel a little disconnected unless someone pulls the thread through them. So let's pull that thread together, folks. This schedule release tells us when this team is going to be tested, not just competitively, but logistically. Road trips, short weeks, early season chaos, which every NWSL team deals with, but expansion teams, it feels twice as hard, right? Because they're still trying to find that gel and that cohesiveness. And then you layer in the fact that they still don't really have that home stadium. That Centennial Stadium news hurts. It not being ready for the start of the season, it's not a failure. Honestly, it's a construction reality. It does mean that this team is going to be starting life without a settled home environment. That matters. They're not going to have that home locker room, that home routine, the familiar sight lines. All of that matters. And players, they absolutely are going to feel that, even if us fans, are not going to see it. Now let's connect that back to the roster. When you know you're starting the season bouncing between venues, so first at Mile High, then they're going to be at Dick's Sporting Goods, and then they're going to be at the Centennial Stadium, you don't build a fragile team. You are going to build something that relies on perfect conditions. You build something that can travel, adapt, and self-organize. You might be saying, now, Kate, are you really going to be harping on these 3 stadiums like this for the whole episode? No, but I want to point this out because this is a team that's still trying to gel. They are still trying to figure out how they run, how they adapt, who moves certain ways. And when you're bouncing between venues, that's just an added layer that this team is going to have to build through, have to play through, have to gel through. That's another reason why this Heaps signing feels like a pivot point instead of just a splash. That's why the balance across lines matter, why there is a clear emphasis on defensive depth and midfield stability. That's why the international attackers make sense now instead of feeling premature. This roster isn't being built for fairy tale, home opener followed by, smooth sailing. It's being built for a messy first season that has leadership built in, and that's extremely refreshing. As someone who has covered this sport long enough to remember when women's teams were constantly asked to prove that they belong, I don't take that lightly. There is a seriousness here that I really respect. So if you've been listening week to week to the 5280 pitch and you're wondering, okay, what's the big picture now? This is it. Denver Summit FC is no longer just assembling pieces. They're transitioning into preparation mode. The signings are less about discovery and more about readiness. The conversations are less about who are they and more about how does this unit work together. And that's exactly where this mid-preseason reset episode is hopefully going to land with all of you. So in the next segment, I want to walk through the roster as a whole, not player by player, not repeating profiles, but looking at what kind of team this is shaping up to be, especially given the realities of the schedule and the venue situation. The first wave of players that the Summit signed was getting players through the door. Allie Watt, who recently was married, and now she is Allie Brazier. Brazier? I'm going to have to double check on that, how to say her new last name. But she's recently married, so congratulations to Allie. And everyone, if you are loving the podcast, it's also on YouTube. You can follow me on the socials. Be sure to share this with a friend. The more people that we can get onto this 5280 pitch, excitement, community, bandwagon, whatever you want to call it, the better. Because we are trying to build community from day one, before the first match, the first kick even happens at Mile High. So share this podcast with a friend. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast. And leave me a review. It matters more than you could ever know. So when the Summit signed Allie, that was a huge signing because she is a local player. She was that number one signing for the Summit. And expansion rosters don't tell their full story all at once. They tell it in waves. And wave one was about getting bodies in the door, establishing positional coverage, making sure it wasn't a theoretical team. And that phase is over, folks. We are now in wave two, the one that is about definition. So let's start there. When you look at this roster as a whole, the first thing that jumps out is distribution. There is no area of the field that feels neglected. Goalkeeper is not an afterthought. The back line isn't paper thin. Midfield isn't a single name solution. The forward group isn't built around one idea. That tells you something right away. And if you've watched the NWSL long enough, you know exactly why. This league punishes teams that rely too heavily on one player, one system, or one plan. As much as I hate it, yes, folks, in Denver, we know this especially. Injuries happen. We saw this just last Sunday with Bo Nix. They're going to happen, and whether you want them to or not. International windows happen. In fact, Lindsey, she's still finishing her season with Paris. So she's set to finish through June 2026 with her team over in Paris. So those international windows, that's going to happen. Short rest weeks happen. So the teams that survive, especially early, are the ones that can absorb punches without collapsing. So let's talk about some of the defensive construction, because this is where I think the Summit strategy is the most obvious. They've invested heavily in defenders, and not just numbers, but types. Players who can play centrally, players who can shift wide, players who can bring different types of experience into the room. And that matters because this team is not walking into a settled environment. So let's look at how the roster is currently built. Right now, we have two goalkeepers, one of which is a former Colorado Real player and University of Colorado goalkeeper, 8 defenders, 6 midfielders, and 6 forward. And that distribution matters because what the Summit did not do is, like I said before, overload any one line. There isn't a forward-heavy build, out there chasing goals. There isn't a midfield-first philosophy where everything else gets figured out later. This roster is built with a positional redundancy, especially defensively. And I do want to talk about league experience because we do have some brand new faces who are new to the NWSL, like Jordan Knights, former Real player and CU buff. And we also have some veterans on the team because this is a place where the strategy is very clear. The majority of this roster is made up of players who have already played in the NWSL or who have played at a professional level where travel, physicality, and compressed schedules are the norm. And what you don't see is a roster built around a heavy draft class, multiple raw prospects who need years to develop, or a lot of international signings with no league context. And this tells me that the front office made a very deliberate calculation that year one for the Summit is about baseline performance, not ceiling chasing. And that's extremely smart because the NWSL doesn't reward potential in April. It rewards teams that can survive, teams that can get points when they're not sharp, teams that don't mentally collapse when things get weird, and things always get weird. So let's zoom out on the international signings because this is another area where the strategy is more disciplined than flashy. There are international attackers on this roster, notably Nakari Garcia and Melissa Kostler, but notice what's missing. No mass import of internationals, no attempt to outskill the league, no roster built around players who need adaptation simultaneously. This is selective international recruitment, not identity outsourcing. And that matters because it suggests that the summit wants international influence, not international dependence. These players are being added to an existing structure, not asked to define it. So how did the summit respond roster-wise? They didn't chase youth. They didn't chase volatility. They didn't chase project players. Instead, they loaded their roster with players who have already lived through instability. The league changes, team changes, coaching changes, travel chaos. That is not accidental. That is operational planning. You don't build this kind of roster if you expect everything to be smooth. You build it if you expect friction. And while we're talking about friction, I want to talk about the schedule because the midfield depth becomes the clearest strategic tell. 6 midfielders, it might not sound dramatic, but where midfielders cover the most ground and absorb the most contact, that number matters, especially early in the season, especially at altitude. This roster does not require the same 3 midfielders to play 90 minutes every week for the team to function. And that's huge. That tells me that the coaching staff and front office are already thinking in blocks, not just matches. Who can rotate? Who can manage load? Who can step in without the team losing shape? And that's not about tactics yet. That's about survivability. The summit didn't prioritize a year one or bust mindset. They treated the roster like it was built with a 3-year horizon, even while respecting the urgency of year one. There were a lot of season tickets that were sold. They are building a brand new stadium specifically for this team. And there are, unfortunately, a lot of naysayers out there that don't think that a women's professional team can fill a stadium, that would like to see them fail. Year one is extremely important, but they were building for the future. And that's why the Lindsey Heaps signing hits the way that it does, not because it changes the direction, but because it confirms it. So if you're listening to this episode and you're trying to understand what the Denver Summit thinks it's doing, here's the cleanest version I can give you. The club is not trying to win the expansion narrative. They're trying to win functional weeks. They're trying to avoid falling behind the league's rhythm. They're trying to arrive at mid-season still coherent. That's the strategy. That's measurable. And that's visible in these roster choices. All right, so let's really ground this now because I don't want to just talk around the roster. I want to talk about what these additions are actually telling us. When I look at the Denver Summit and who they've added over the last stretch, the first thing that jumps out is intent. And specifically, it's intent around raising the floor of the team, not blowing the ceiling off. We had 8 signings in the past week, and of course, the most notably being Lindsey Heaps. But just because she's the captain of the U.S. women's national team doesn't mean that she's the best player on the Denver Summit. No, it's not golf we're talking about here, folks. Every single one of these players on the Summit matter, and they all have an extremely important role. So I've talked about some of these players already in their own player profiles. So Allie Watt, or Brazier, was the very first signing. I've already done full episode on her. I've done a full episode on Abby Smith, Carson Pickett, and Lindsey Heaps. If you want those deep dives, those are there. I'm not redoing them here. This is about everyone else that the Summit have signed. I'm going to do full player profiles on them. And I want to talk about how all these signings are going to work as a group, because even though I'm going to do a full player profile on every single one of these players, this episode is not about the individuals. It's about why this group together makes sense. Because when you line up the signings by date and strip away the announcement graphics and the headlines, which you should definitely check out on 5280 Pitch Instagram and on the YouTube. So be sure that you follow me on the socials, because when you line up all those signings by date and you strip away those graphics that I make so beautifully online, what Denver Summit actually does is build a team in layers, not stars first, not youth first, functions first. So let's start with the simplest truth. This roster was not built around a single idea of how soccer should look. It was built around how soccer actually happens in this league. So early on, you see those attacking signings like Ali Brazier and Nikari Garcia. Not because the club wanted to be flashy, but because they wanted threat to exist from day one. If you listen to the Ali Watt episode, she is super fast. She knows how to score. That tells me the club understood something really basic. If you can't scare anyone, nothing else you build matters. These players aren't here to be the entire offense. They are here so that the team has a reason to push the game forward into the attacking zone. Then if you look at the midfield additions, Bosch early on, then Heaps, then McCormick, and then Lynch. And what jumps out isn't creativity, it is connectivity. This is a midfield that is built to link things together, to keep the game from breaking in half. This midfield is a connector. All of them. They are known for connecting to make sure that the team can move as a unit instead of as parts. That tells me that the Summit didn't want specialists who only thrive in perfect conditions. They wanted players who make other people better simply by being where they are supposed to be. They're in the right place at the right time. They are dependable. They are reliable. And then you look at the defense, because this is where the collective logic really becomes obvious. Kurtz, Reed, Biglaski, Pickett. Okay, by the way, congratulations, just got her first call-up for the U.S. women's national team training camp, so congratulations to her. But that is a very strong back line. That is not redundancy by accident. That is redundancy by design. This is a back line built on the assumption that the season is going to be physical, unpredictable, and messy. No one defender is being asked to define or carry the team. They are being asked to protect the team from volatility, to make sure one injury, one bad week, one tough matchup isn't going to unravel everything else. You have someone back there like Pickett, who not only is a strong defender, but is going to be able to help push up the game and is a scoring threat. And that when you have a defense back there that is so reliable, that's the key phrase here. Reliability throughout this entire team. Everyone on that team plays a consistent game. And then you factor in the goalkeepers, Smith and Knights. You see the same philosophy. Not one solution, two professionals, a position treated as a partnership, not a gamble. And when you zoom out, this group starts to make a whole lot of sense. These players matter not because of what they do individually, but because of what they allow the team to be. They allow rotation, they allow adaptation, they allow bad days to happen without disaster, because every single player has that sense of reliability. They allow a brand new club to look like a team instead of a collection of debuts. Everyone on this team is a consistent player. And that's why I'm glad I'm doing the individual profile episodes after this moment, not before, because when you understand this structure, the individual stories are going to land differently. You're going to stop asking, well, wait, why did they sign her? And what problem does she solve? Or what type of player is she? Underneath all of this, every single one of these players, they are consistent. There's not one player on here that's like, oh, if you can, it's like lightning in a bottle. None of these players are like that. All of these players have that consistent reliability amongst them that are going to just help us as an expansion team. This roster does not scream ego. It doesn't scream shortcuts. It doesn't scream panic. It screams intention. Every one of these players fills space, not in the bad way, not just on the field, but in the season. They build margin, they build resilience, they build the summit as something that can hold its shape, even while still finding its identity. So when I say that these signings matter, I don't mean that they matter because they're famous or that they're flashy or that they're familiar. They matter because together they form something that can actually exist in this league from day one. And that is the foundation that everything else grows out of. So as we wrap up this mid-preseason reset, I have a lot of player profiles still to do. We're still going to talk about the schedule. If you haven't checked it out yet, I know I keep talking about it, but you got to follow me on social. I created a graphic of all the national televised games that are going to be out there, so check that out. I want to leave you with one simple idea, because if you remember nothing else from this episode, remember this. Denver Summit didn't build this roster to be impressive on paper. Yes, the Lindsey Heaps signing gave the entire NWSL notice, reason to put the summit on, notice out there. Like, oh, well, we might need to pay attention to that game out there in Denver. But they built this roster to hold together. And that might not sound sexy, but it's actually the hardest thing to do when you're starting from nothing. Every single one of these signings, even the ones that didn't get big headlines, even the ones that came in quietly, after the Heap signing, after the stadium announcement, after the roster was released, all of these signings matter because they add structure, they add options, they add answers before the questions even show up. This is a team that can rotate without panicking, a team that can absorb injuries without reinventing itself, a team that can change a few pieces without losing the plot. And that's why this episode felt really necessary for me, because when signings come in fast, it's easy to think of them as isolated events, one announcement, one graphic, one tweet. But when you take a step back and you look at the whole picture, what you see is a roster that's been assembled very, very intentionally, not with urgency. And that gives me a ton of confidence as a fan. Not confidence that everything is going to be perfect. I'm not expecting to go out there and, win it all. I mean, would it be awesome to have a season like the Avs did back in, 96? Yeah, it'd be amazing. But is that normal for new teams? No. I don't have confidence that there's not going to be rough stretches. But when things do get uncomfortable, and they will, this team is not going to fold in on itself. And here's where I want to bring this back to us, because this show isn't about tactics or roster math. It's about building a soccer community around our club here in Denver. A community in Colorado that understands what it is watching. So over the next stretch, I'm going to keep rolling out those player profiles one by one, and we're going to do that with context. We're not asking, who is this player? We're asking, why does this player matter here? That is the better question, and it leads to better conversations. So if you're listening to this and you've been feeling overwhelmed with the pace of the news or unsure how all of this fits together, that's normal. Expansion seasons are messy, but this roster is making more and more sense every single day. And that's a really good place to start. As always, if you've got thoughts, disagreements, questions, or players that you want me to dig into next, you know where to find me. I'm on the socials, Instagram at 5280pitch, Facebook, on YouTube. You can find me online at 5280pitch.com. This show gets better the more we treat it like a conversation, not a broadcast. I will be bringing in players to interview, more conversations the better. Thanks for hanging with me through this reset. Be sure to like, subscribe, leave me a review. Thanks for caring enough about this team to think critically about it. This has been the 5280 Pitch, women's soccer at altitude, and we're just getting started.